I think it's worth mentioning as we now go on to Split.
DID is still a very contested thing as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, well, so I've actually got the two diagnoses here. So there's bits from the World Health Organization's booklet, and there's also from the DSM-5. Josh has reliably informed me that the World Health Organization's one is slightly better, but they haven't got much on multiple personality disorder per se. They just got it as a subcategory, whereas the DSM-5 have a more elaborate explanation of what actually features as part of this disorder. So, disruption of identity characterized by two or more distinct personality states, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession, like the beast. The disruption in identity involves marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and/or sensory motor functioning. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported in the individual. Number 2, recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and/or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. So there's amnesia and discordance between the identities that you're slipping in. So each one has their own set of memories, and only if they talk to each other and communicate information can any of the personalities actually know what the other is thinking. And so that means that the core sub-personality, the main person, so Billy or Kevin, is kept deliberately in the dark by his other identities. It's quite interesting. The symptoms can cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, so you can't live a normal life. The disturbance is not a normal part of broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. Note, in children, symptoms are not better explained by imaginary playmates or fantasy play. So that seems a bit culturally relativist and has been put in there by the activists, frankly, because I don't know many cultures, other than if you're going to try and say the two-spirit idea, which was cooked up in the 90s by gay activists and then retroactively
was it really?
Yeah, it's not a Native American thing, no.
Oh, I've never taken the time to look into it.
Yeah, Matt Walsh has spoken about it before. It's quite
okay.
funny. Unless you're going to try and genuflect to that example of saying, oh, you can have two genders in you at once, which does really mean you're crazy.
Isn't that like when what's-his-face who played the black guy in Star Wars Empire Strikes Back? I forget his name.
Billy D. Williams.
Yeah, Billy D. Williams. Didn't he say a few years ago, oh, I'm in touch with my feminine side? And then
everyone went, gay!
Oh, so he's a non-binary. He says he's non-binary. And he just comes out and is like, what the hell does that mean?
I just wear capes because they're flat. And the last one is, the symptoms are not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, like blackouts during alcohol intoxication or another medical condition like partial seizures. So it has to be a distinct psychological condition without any physical causes or physical trauma, perhaps. Nebulous definitions there, but mainly you can't self-induce different identities. Funnily enough, there's some interesting stuff between the male and female breakdown. Most women with dissociative identity disorder predominate in adult clinical settings, but not in child clinical settings. Adult males with DID deny their symptoms and trauma histories, and this can lead to elevated rates of false negative diagnoses. Females with DID present more frequently with acute dissociative states like flashbacks, amnesia, fugue states, functional neurological conversion symptoms, hallucinations, and self-mutilation, whereas males commonly exhibit more criminal or violent behavior than females.
So what you're telling me is, in every situation, as always, women just far more desperate for attention.
Yeah, attention is porn for women. Also, 70% of DID outpatients have attempted suicide. So the way that DID is manifested, despite some of the reeing critics online from the left that said this film stigmatizes mental health in Split, along the gender breakdowns and the suicidality, it does track pretty well with how this might manifest in someone if it's a genuine disorder.
From the interviews that I read that he gave around Split, it seemed like Shyamalan did a lot of research into the disorder, and he was acutely aware of just how many personalities can develop, how they develop, because what you learn is that Kevin Wendell Crumb, the actual person that all of these personalities are inhabiting, he was abused by his mother as a child due to a lack of a father figure.
That's actually from the WHO and National Library of Medicine version. That's the most common way that this disorder gets induced, because from an early childhood state, if you do not integrate the personality in different aspects during development, then the personality becomes permanently disintegrated as a defense mechanism.
I mean, that does make sense to me. So I understand that it can be contested. I understand that Billy Milligan, whatever his name,
Billy Milligan, yeah.
Billy Milligan. His story seemed a little bit convenient and fantastical from what I remember. It was very convenient that, oh no, I didn't murder and rape those people. It was the other version of me.
I'll go through that in a moment if you don't mind.
From a lay person, that makes sense. And one of the interesting things that you learn in Glass was that the accident that killed Kevin's father was actually the Eastrail derailing that led to Mr. Glass being able to find David. So it all ties in quite nicely. But it is interesting that his personalities develop as a defense mechanism, as you stated, against certain behaviors that his mum would punish him for. For instance, Dennis develops because he says that staying clean, keeping everything spotless, was one of the ways to keep her attention away from him. So she seems to, it's very dirty around here. I'm going to get the cane.
What ended up happening is you get two flashbacks. You get one in Unbreakable Split, and then you get one in Glass. The one in Split is Kevin hiding under the bed because he has made a mess, and his mum comes in with a coat hanger.
It's actually pretty scary.
In Glass, the worst one is there's no running in the house, and she chases him with a hot iron, and then you just hear a scream of him being scalded. That is genuinely quite harrowing.
Those sorts of behavior, those sorts of experiences, I would imagine would lead you to come up with some kind of defense mechanism. So it makes sense within the context of the universe.
Here's the conflict about Billy's story is because he had something very similar. So I'll just briefly explain. So Billy Milligan was the first real-life quitter of a person with DID, and he was acquitted for 4 counts of rape, 3 counts of aggravated robbery and kidnapping of 3 women on the Ohio State University campus. Billy's dad, when he was younger, committed suicide by asphyxiating himself with carbon monoxide in his car at a motel. His mum then remarried her first alcoholic husband to support Billy, his brother, and his sister, and then she had an affair while as a nightclub singer with a guy named Chalmer Milligan, who was her 4th husband, again. And she had a daughter who already had a daughter called Charlia, and the pair got married and adopted each other's children. Chalmer was an abusive alcoholic. He raped Billy multiple times in a barn. He buried him alive and put a funnel in his mouth and pissed in his mouth.
Jesus.
Yeah, and all of these stories Billy retold as a subpersonality called Tommy, and Tommy was a small child, much like Hedwig, who was the only person able to remember the trauma, much like Dennis is the only personality able to actually remember what they went through. Milligan developed 24 personalities, so that's where the number came from Split.
Because it starts off as 23 and the 24th is revealed as the beast.
And also he had a distinction between the desirables and the undesirables, much like Dr. Fletcher distinguishes between Patricia, Dennis, Hedwig, and eventually the Beast versus all the other personalities, which are benign but a bit eccentric. So he had 10 desirables. So that was Billy, his core personality. Arthur, who spoke in an English accent, which was very manipulative. Reagan, which was based on the Yugoslavian spy in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and spoke in a Yugoslavian accent. Vasdanovich, Alan, Tommy, who's the small child, Danny, David, Christine, Christopher, and Adalanya. And Adalanya was who committed the rapes. She was a repressed lesbian. Very strange.
All right.
Then 13 undesirables. Phil, Kevin, Walter, April, Samuel, Mark, Steve, Lee, Jason, Bobby, Sean, Martin, and Timothy. And then finally, the teacher, which was a fusion of all the other personalities and mediated their discussions when one was taking the spot in the light, whereas the rest were in chairs and the teacher was telling them what the others thought.
Okay, so evidently Shyamalan did a lot of reading into this particular case to inspire the portrayal of Kevin.
The interesting thing about the identities is when they were testing them, there is some discrepancy as to how authentic it was, because in the early tests, the pre-trial tests, his IQ is fluctuating between clinical retardation and genius, depending on the personality.
All right.
His Rorschach test evaluations, which aren't very reliable, but they were wildly inconsistent, depending on what personality was being manifested. And then they took EEG readings of his brainwaves. And between personalities, they changed the mental age of what you would expect for him. So when he was in the Tommy personality of a young boy, he genuinely had the mental readings on the EEG of a young boy.
I can't really distinct between memories, the realities, because my emotions split so far apart. Love, hate, and fear. And
that might be the limitations of the tech at the time. We can't put it down to it. But it does raise some suspicions.
It would be very impressive for somebody to purposefully fool the systems in such a way, so consistently, and in such a reliably accurate way to what they would expect from people of those personalities.
The personalities also emerged inconsistently when he reverted to Billy immediately became confused, didn't know why he was detained, didn't remember anything, claimed to not, and actually smashed up the urinal in his cell to slit his wrist with the porcelain, whereas the other personalities didn't manifest any traits of suicidality. So
Okay,
it's much
because-
like when Kevin regresses to being Kevin and tells Casey to grab the shotgun and shoot him because he can't remember the last couple of years.
I think within the context of the film, that's because he just recognizes what a danger he has become, given that he just looks down, oh, that's my psychiatrist, I just murdered her. Oh, okay, well, I guess I should probably die then, which I thought was quite a heroic moment for him in a otherwise very dark film. Split is probably the darkest of these three.
Absolutely.
Just because, one, Kevin's actual circumstances alone are very, very distressing, and then the backstory to the main female character, Casey, as well, is just a bit horrible, and I'm not actually a big fan of that backstory. I understand what it does. It's a nice contrast between the two ways in which people can develop and work through their trauma.
Yeah.
In the case of Kevin, he develops these incredibly destructive personalities that all have an aggravated sense of victimhood against the rest of the world. That's why he ends up developing the cult-like elements of the Horde, where they see anybody who has not been damaged in some way as impure and therefore deserving of death, which in my opinion seems to be very allegorical, whether intentional or not, to the current victimhood mentality that we've got right now, where people, yes, they experience bad things in their life and they experience trauma in their life. There's two ways of developing with that. You either learn from it and allow that experience to make you stronger.
Like Casey eventually does.
Like Casey does in a what doesn't kill you makes you stronger element, or the more modern element of what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Everybody else is everybody else has victimized me. The very SJW, the world sucks, therefore I've experienced bad things, therefore I must change the rest of the world to fit my vision. That for me was the theme that I had experienced running through the film.
I think you're absolutely spot on, and I think we can find some stuff both in the outside psychological literature and within the film to validate this. Now, in the film, Miss Patricia recites repeatedly the poem she reads on the greeting cards for funerals when putting the girls back in their isolated rooms, which is, in the sun we will find our passion, in the sun we will find our purpose. And when, mythologically speaking, the sun is presented, it's usually as a higher ideal to strive towards. It can also be a warning, like with Icarus, if you fly too close to it, you plunge into the depths. But normally it's looking upwards. It's moving
aspirational.
Upwards. Exactly. It's transcendent. In this, it doesn't seem to be the case, because they are evolving, but they're evolving into a sub-personality that's a fractured part of the whole, because it's not a reintegration, it's a further regression away from the human into the animal. So you're invulnerable physically, but you are completely non-conscious mentally. And so what I think it is, less so a movement towards a transcendent ideal of integration, but it's more bringing the marginal into the mainstream. It's bringing what is underground into the light. It's the progressive idea of the outcast must become the paramount in society. And so it is reshaping the entire world to accommodate and celebrate your trauma, because if you abandon your trauma, you abandon your sense of self and you regress to the most vulnerable version of yourself, which is Kevin. So the Beast is actually a progressive death cult.
Yeah, I agree with that reading. That's pretty much my reading and thought process on the whole film. And when you reference the sun as well, like you say, it can be aspirational, it can be looking up. It can also be very destructive in this case of Icarus, because it burns things.
Yes.
It's a big ball of fire, which it can be a very destructive force, and almost in the same way that later on he implies and in Glass outright states that he wants to cause some form of revolution. He just wants to burn the whole world down around him so that he can rebuild something more pure and more perfect from the ashes, whereas in reality, the person who would be doing that is a broken individual who has manifested all of the most negative traits. And in the sense that Unbreakable puts forward the masculine virtues of nurturing, protecting, striving, becoming a role model, Split is kind of a more accurate representation of something that, and I'm not saying this in an SJW sense, of a more toxic masculinity.
No.
That's what
I don't think it's
terms
toxically masculine at all.
No, I think in terms of the traits that the Beast embodies in some of his more animalistic, purely strength lashing out, can be where you can take the protective element, because they are all there to protect Kevin. It can, where the protective can become destructive.
I think you see that more commonly in the devouring mothers that we see with Elijah's mother, or with especially the mythological parallels of Tiamat, the great dragon that devours the world. So it's something literally more monstrous that comes from chaos, that requires a regression away from the human experience to birth outwards. I think you see that more with the feminine, and that's why I think Patricia has been chosen as the androgynous high priestess, because we're seeing that in contemporary culture with lots of androgynous looking men grooming young children, regressing them to a childlike state and literally abusing them.
That's all fair, but in the same sense, when we see those androgynous men wearing dresses, you also see them acting in a very toxically masculine way towards women, shall we say, in how aggressive they are, in how much they completely dismiss concerns for their own sense of protection. And that's what I see here, because the feminine aspect of that toxic femininity, I think, mixes well with the toxic masculinity to create something that is just ultimately an incredibly destructive force. Because let's be honest, without the power of strong men being able to assert their will by force, toxic women, in that sense, wouldn't have anybody to do to undertake their bidding for them, so to speak.
My objection would be with the conjunction of the terms toxic and masculinity, because masculinity and femininity are meant to describe a set of virtues, and no virtue is embodied there. It's just feminine behaviors, but it's not necessarily feminine virtues. Does that make sense? Or same with masculine behaviors or masculine virtues. I'm not going to... I don't think drawing a parallel of the animalism of the beast to masculinity is necessarily lined up, but I do think the strange androgyny does meld itself to why Kevin and then the beast later on become so monstrous.
Well, we can agree to disagree for the time being, because my reading of the masculine traits that Kevin embodies as the beast being a counterpoint to the masculine virtues that David embodies in Unbreakable being counterpoints to one another, that ties into my reading of
that's interesting. We found a little bit of conflict here. There was also, I found this relating to the idea of victimhood making you purer, turning the world, as you said, the fire motif of the sun will turn the world into a crucible that will burn the impurities off and leave only the pure, unbreakable metal at the center. There's a study that was looking into signaling virtuous victimhood as an indicator of dark triad personalities, and because the research has posited that the West has upheld the idea of egalitarian rights and innate value within each people, and then the liberal idea of dismantling all arbitrary state impositions on those rights, to dismantling all kinds of impositions on our ability to be equal and manifest equal virtue. This is being exploited by people who use victim signaling as a mechanism via which they can transfer resources unduly to themselves, because they feign as victims and they're most conscious about being Machiavellian social manipulators. They most feel narcissistic, so they feel entitled to the resources, and they're psychopathic, so they have a diminished capacity for moral knowledge. Then this allows them to exploit the system deftly to get their undue rewards. And so the philosophy of the beast being that those who are victimized and, say, mired in victimhood are the more pure. No, they're actually, turns out, the most capricious and resentful people, because they haven't fully integrated their personalities in themselves and overcome their crushing sense of inadequacy like David has. And so they'll be the people staffing the utopia that just perennially eat each other and steal each other's stuff.
I mean, literally eat each other in this circumstance.
Yeah.
Although he does only eat those that he considers impure, which
exactly. He's taking from the people who haven't been victimized adequately to redistribute to the victims. The beast is basically an animal communist.
I'll accept that reading of it.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.